Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Jane. I'm doing a read aloud of The Boys' War by Jim Murphy. We're on chapter 5, A Long and Hungry War. We're on page 45. Pork, hardback biscuits, sugar, and coffee being loaded into supply wagons at the Commissionary Depot in Cedar Level, Virginia. Once it was clear to both sides that they were in a real fight, one that was not simply going to fade away, some important steps had to be taken. First, many more soldiers would be needed. Second, ragtag amateur soldiers would have to be better trained. And third, somehow enough supplies and arms had to be found to keep the soldiers in the field. The first two needs were reasonably easy to address. Before the first year of fighting was over, both the Union and Confederate governments issued calls for massive numbers of enlistments. These would not be 90-day enlistments. The new soldiers would be signing on for 3 years. An estimated 2,898,304 would serve in the Union Army during the war, while the Confederate side would see almost 1,500,000 join. Creating good soldiers began with the officers. Many men had become officers through political favoritism or because they had been able to sign up enough recruits to make a regiment. Others were elected by the soldiers themselves, usually because they were popular, easygoing fellows. Such officers did not know how to handle groups of men during the battle and never earned their respect either. The Union moved quickly to weed out these weak officers. Military boards were set up to examine officers, and over the next few months, hundreds of officers were discharged or resigned. This did not put a complete end to the practice of appointing or electing officers, but it did establish some minimum standards for competence. As noted before, the South seemed to have gotten a better crop of officers from the start. Why did this happen? One reason is that 8 military schools in the country had, in 1860, 7 of those were located in the South. Generally, officers remained loyal to the regions where they were trained. Of the 1,900 men who attended Virginia Military Academy, over 1,750 would serve for the South. This does not mean that every officer in the Confederate Army was a seasoned veteran. One very young officer wrote, "Well, here at Taylorsville, we have daily evening battalion drills, of which I know nothing in the world. In vain, I do take Harder's tactics in my hand and try to study out the maneuvers." It was not at all unusual to see large formations of soldiers being drilled by an officer with his manual of instructions firmly in hand. But as the officer learned their duties, so did the soldiers. The problem was that neither side quite solved how to supply was troops with enough food. A few statistics will show the immense size of the problems faced by each side. An army of 100,000 soldiers required 2,500 supply wagons and at least 35,000 horses and mules for use by the cavalry and to haul the wagons and artillery. Men and horses consumed 600 tons of supplies every day. Food had to be gathered from various growing regions and then shipped hundreds of miles by train to supply bases. Then they had to be loaded into wagons and brought to the troops in the field. As these full wagons were moving in, empty wagons had to be on the way back to the supply depots to load up the next day's supplies. All this movement had to be timed and carried out with precision if the soldiers were going to be fed on time. After fumbling for the first year, both the Union and Confederate armies managed to organize and coordinate their supply efforts. And they worked reasonably well for the most part. Young Thomas Galway, because supplies were generally scarce, a regiment was allowed to a specific amount of each item. Here, loaves of bread are weighed before distribution to the troops. Thomas Galloway seemed pleased with his rations. The food issued to the soldiers is very good in an amiable quantity. Consists of salt pork or fresh beef, soft baked bread in the field ovens, and hardtack on the march and in campaign, coffee and sugar. For vegetables, desiccated potatoes, mixed desiccated vegetables for soup, and beans and rice and onions. Besides these, we can buy from the Sulter all sorts of delicacies such as oysters, canned fruit, cheese, raisins, tobacco, and the last, though not least, whiskey. But the food supply system was a delicate ballet of movement that could not be disrupted by any one of number of things. Spring rains might turn the dirt roads into a quagmire of mud that could delay wagons for several days. A sudden movement of troops might put them in an area without adequate roads, cutting them off from supplies for days or weeks. One 16-year-old soldier from New York, Charles Knott, tells about his regiment's troubles during a particularly cold winter. Again, we sat down beside the campfire for supper. It consisted of hard pilot bread, raw pork, and coffee. The coffee you would probably not recognize in New York, boiled in an open kettle and about the color of brownstone front. It was nevertheless the only warm thing we had. The cook's about to serve a hot meal. The pork was frozen, and the water was in canteens with solid ice, so we had to hold them over the fire when we wanted a drink. No one had plates or spoons, knives or forks, cups or saucers. We cut off the frozen pork with our pocket knives, and one tin cup from which we each took a drink in turn served the coffee. Another common complaint among the soldiers was that the food they did get was almost always the same, a never ending diet of salt pork, dried beef, beans, potatoes, turnips, and corn. After eating army food for nearly 3 years, Frank Caruth wrote to his sister, I want Pa to be certain and buy wheat enough to do us plentiful, for if the war closes and I get home, I never intend to chew any more cornbread. Luxuries such as eggs, milk, butter, wheat flour, and sugar were scarce at the best of times and often absent for months. No wonder that one boy, R.O.B. Morrow, could write with such enthusiasm about his meal. We are now permitted to get something to eat. I ran into the store. I got a hold of a tin washpan, drew it full of molasses, got a box of good Yankee crackers, sat down on the ground in the vacant lot, and dipped the crackers into the molasses and ate the best meal I ever had. Stores weren't always handy, especially in wilderness areas. At these times, soldiers could buy anything from soldiers. Soldiers were not an official part of the military, but they were permitted to trail after troops and sell things like food, razor blades, paper, and thread. Soldiers acquired these hard to come by items directly from the manufacturers or through European sources. Often they bought stolen goods and then charged the soldiers 2 or 3 times the original purchase price. At one point in the war, eggs were selling for $6 a dozen, and bacon cost $15 a pound. Soldiers did not only charge high prices, sometimes they would refuse to sell food to soldiers they did not know or did not like. Whenever this, soldiers lined up outside a soldier's tent. Whenever this happened, the young soldiers would find another way to get a meal. Elisha Stockwell took great delight in outwitting one greedy soldier. Ed, I saw him put a big sweet potato in one of his wagons, and on the way back, he got that potato. It was so long he couldn't hide it in his haversack, so he put the haversack under his coat and in camp asked me if I could hide it. I said yes. I made a hole in the middle of the fire and covered it with ashes and coals. We waited till all had laid down to go to sleep. We dug it out, and it was baked fine, and it was all we could eat that night and the next morning. How did Stockwell feel about eating his stolen food? Apparently not bad at all. It was the best as well as the biggest potato I ever saw. Whether it was in a letter home or a journal, food was probably the most written about topic. Soldiers were constantly waiting for food supplies to show up or commenting unhappily about their supply quantity, their quality, quantity, and variety when they did arrive. At times like these, soldiers often resorted to foraging to supplement their disappointing meals. Foraging simply meant living off the land around them. At times, they might hunt deer or bear in the nearby forests, or gather nuts and berries. These activities took a great deal of time, something a marching soldier did not have. Instead, soldiers had to take a more direct approach to finding a meal. They walked up to a farmer's home and offered to buy whatever food was available. If the request was refused, they would take what they wanted, sometimes at gunpoint. Both armies had strict rules against foraging, and those caught could find themselves in jail from anywhere from a week to a month. But threats of going to jail did not put a halt to foraging. In fact, when guards were set out at night, they were still to keep soldiers in camp as much as to watch out for an enemy attack. Still, a hungry boy could always find a way through even the tightest security, as John Delaney makes clear. Another nightly occupation is to rob beehives, and not infrequently, when the chorus of religious hymns is ascending, parties return from a thieving expedition with hats filled with the honeycomb. Finding food was a constant challenge for the boys in the Civil War, even when safely in camp. Imagine what Charles Knott must have felt after his company became lost in enemy territory and ran out of food. After they had wandered aimlessly for several days and barely escaped the capture twice, their luck changed. They stumbled across a house in the woods. No smoke rises from the chimney. We halt. The sergeant enters the open door, comes back and reports it is just what we want, a deserted house. After finding corn for the horses, Knot did a quick survey of their newly found bounty. In the yard, he saw chickens, cows, sheep, and pigs. Inside the house, they discovered a jar of molasses, a bag of dried peaches, and a haunch of smoked venison, and a barrel of black walnuts, as well as coffee beans and cornmeal. The food was gathered up, and after the horses had eaten, Knot and his friends continued their search for the army. That night, they pitched camp and prepared a truly luxurious meal for themselves. He picked up his story. Pluck the chickens and cut them up. Mix some meal and water, and make corn dodgers, as the Tennesseans do. They are plates to bake on, and we can try baking it in the ashes. But the coffee, everybody looks forward to it, no matter if it's poor or weak. It is always the tired soldier's great restorative, his particular comfort. The chickens must be stewed in pans and roasted on sticks. Food for the Civil War soldier was always simple, if not downright plain. Few soldiers were skilled cooks, and even those who knew how to prepare food found themselves hampered by lack of herbs, spices, and other ingredients. A little salt and pepper might be the only things available to put on a meal. Even so, most boys seem to have found a great comfort in any meal, no matter how humble. They were able to escape, even if only for an hour or so, from the fighting and death that surrounded them. A meal was a frail link to their recollections of home and family and a better time. Charles Knott closes his recollections of foraging with these thoughts. In the course of half an hour, we have good coffee. Chicken and corn dodgers come along more slowly, but after a while, we sit around the fire to eat them, and everybody declares that he has had enough, and that is very good.